Here we are again. So we're going to talk about advanced storm damage assessment. And I'm sorry to repeat anything, but the technical difficulties, I'll just kind of get going from the beginning. So we're going to talk about the roof and the building envelope in terms of storm damage assessment. There's a lot of different types of perils that we can look at: flooding, lightning, all those kinds of things. But we're going to kind of focus on the two main perils of hail and wind as it relates to a lot of my experience comes from the insurance restoration industry. So a lot of what we're going to talk about kind of butts up against that just because so many of the definitions come from that industry because their stuff usually can go to court and things like that. And there's judges involved. Defining words is really important. So anyway, it's important for a home inspector to know how to assess for storm damage. Now, it doesn't have to be part of your everyday home inspection that you do, a thorough storm damage assessment. But when you encounter something that you think might be storm damage, or you're working in an area where gets hit by storms quite often, you're going to need to know some of the protocols and some of the ways that the experts do what they do so that you can employ some of those things just to know that you're in the right ballpark. Again, you don't have to be an expert. You don't have to present yourself as an expert. But if you're going to say, hey, I think this roof might be storm damaged, unfortunately, what's probably going to happen in some of these areas like the Southeast where there are so many storms and there's a booming insurance restoration industry where so many of the roofing companies and the contractors in our area really get a lot of their business from the insurance business because they inspect roofs, they find storm damage, they have the homeowner file a claim, and the insurance company, when they do pay out, they pay out pretty well. So it's important to not always kick it to the roofers because if you're in an area that's really roofer heavy like North Carolina, probably, best case scenario, right? We find an electrical issue as a home inspector and we say, okay, call, a licensed electrician. I think there may be an issue here. Unfortunately, and there's no way to really avoid this altogether. But if you have any doubts or considerations that you're not totally sure about, and so we say, it may be hail damage, maybe it's not. Why don't you call a roofing contractor and find out? Unfortunately, most of those roofing contractors are even less qualified than you to look at that and to assess for that. And you would love to believe that you could pick up the phone and call a construction company or a roofing company and get a construction or a roofing expert out to your home. It's just not always the case. And in my area, it's very often not the case. You get a salesperson who really wants to sell a new roof. And so, again, we can't avoid that process altogether. But what we want to do is be sure, or at least relatively sure, that what we're saying is correct, right? You can be an expert, but you don't have to present yourself as an expert. And you can say, look, I get a pretty good idea. There might be some hail damage up there. You might want to call a roofer. Knowing that when they get that roofer, it's probably going to result in an insurance claim. You want to be pretty sure that what you're saying is correct. And so on to storm damage. And so, like I said, in the insurance restoration industry, how we define words is really, really important. And so what is storm damage? Of course, it's damage caused from a storm, right? So when we say damage caused by a storm, damage is kind of a tricky word that there's a big debate over in the insurance restoration business. And we'll talk about that a little bit tonight. But damage resulting from a storm-related peril, right? And what does the word peril mean? I'm sure most of you can probably already guess or you already know. But in insurance law, peril is an event or a circumstance that could cause damage to insured property. Okay, and there's all kinds of perils. There's windstorms, hail, explosions, theft, falling objects, water damage, flood damage. There's all these kinds of things. So what we're going to try to focus on, because we're really concerned primarily with the building envelope for the purpose of this webinar, we're going to talk about hail and wind. And so as we get into that, you've got hail and wind. Now, to break that down a little bit further, so when we say storm damage, when we say storm, again, for the purpose of this webinar, we're really mostly talking about hail and wind as perils. And then when we say damage, what are we saying? So there's two different types of hail damage that come up in this context. There's functional hail damage and there's cosmetic hail damage. Functional hail damage, as you can imagine, is best defined as damage that directly affects or degrades the functionality or the purpose of a material, right? Cosmetic would be something that you can recognize, you can demonstrate it, and you can show it to somebody, but it's not going to affect the functionality of the material. Now, it's still damage. I would still say cosmetic damage. Why would I say that? Well, again, this is the debate over the word damage. Is it really damaged if it's just dented? Well, I put it in these terms. If I bought a piece of copper to make a copper bay window roof at my house, if I went to go buy, sheets of copper, several sheets, if one of them was completely peppered, right, and dented completely, I wouldn't buy it. So it's devalued. So again, maybe the functionality is still okay, but the value has definitely been decreased. So we're going to consider that damage. So again, in hail, we've got functional hail damage, we've got cosmetic hail damage. And as it pertains to wind, we've got direct and indirect. So you've got direct wind damage, which is when the wind applies a force to a particular thing, whether it's, a downspout, whether it's a shingle, whatever it might be. If the wind affects it directly and damages it, that would be direct wind damage. Indirect wind damage would be anything that the wind affects that then causes damage. So the biggest one is a tree. So the wind damages a tree, knocks it down, that tree falls on someone's house. That damage is still paid for as wind damage. It's just indirect wind damage rather than direct, if that makes sense. So I like the details. Okay. I like to know what I'm talking about, at least with some level of certainty. And I like to know what's behind what I'm talking about. So what causes these perils, right? Where does hail and wind even come from? We're going to talk about it just a little bit in a little class I like to call Meteorology 101. Now, spoiler alert, I'm not a meteorologist, but I know enough about meteorology from doing what I do, just from being curious and being inquisitive. So I'll teach you guys a little bit about where these perils kind of come from, because it does help when you're looking for things, because all this is going to boil down to is telling the full story, right? When you're doing a storm damage assessment, you want to be able to create a story that makes sense. And that's why I landed there, because there's a lot of different things, especially when it comes to asphalt composition roofs. There's a lot of different scuffs and bumps and scratches and blisters and like all these things that can happen. So you need to be able to assess the whole story and tell the whole story. And so the story begins with where the storms begin. So in order to get wind, so we're going to talk about wind first, because that kind of predicates hail, and I'll explain that in just a second. So wind starts from atmospheric pressure changes, okay? And I know I'm getting coming right off to a bang with atmospheric pressure changes, but go with me. Atmospheric pressures created by literally the weight of the air above us, and there's several levels of the atmosphere, but the weight above us kind of creates an existing pressure that's kind of always there. And it changes from day to day and place to place depending on where you are. So you might hear weather forecaster talk about pressure systems or pressure areas, right? They'll say, oh, we got a low pressure system here, we got a high pressure system there. So what exactly does that mean? Well, a low pressure system is simply an area of low pressure surrounded by higher pressure. So it's air with low density and high temperature surrounded by air with higher density and lower temperature. Okay, so that's a low pressure system. Converse to all that, a high pressure system, it's an area of high pressure surrounded by an area of lower pressure, right? So which is the one we're really more concerned with? Well, I can tell you the moral of that story is low pressure systems. Low pressure systems are really the ones that we're more concerned with. Now, high pressure systems are not without their fallout, right? A high pressure system can trap warm air, leading to prolonged periods of high temperatures, right? And we'd call that a heat wave. You can have a drought that's either caused or exacerbated by a high pressure system, but a low pressure system for what we're talking about is really what we're going to focus on. So a low pressure system is where the wind. So basically, I'll explain in a second on the next slide. I'm getting ahead of myself, but as this pressure change happens, the low pressure system creates an inward spiral of pressure and wind. That all converging in one area is where you'll see the eye of a hurricane or a tornadic activity, these different things. That's really the type of weather that's created by low pressure systems. And that's why we're concerned with low pressure systems. And I'll illustrate here. When I say low pressure system, what you've got is the sun heating up the surface. The hot air rises, as we know, right? And one thing I want to focus on is when I say low pressure versus high pressure, a lot of people, if they've got any kind of a general physics perspective, will kind of correlate low pressure to low temperature and high pressure to high temperature. That is in a closed system, and the atmosphere is not a closed system. So low pressure, again, it's not converse. Low pressure isn't always high temperature, but more often than not, when we're referring to a low pressure system, the lower pressure is left behind when the hot air rises. Okay. So that's why if you look on a temperature map, the red L and blue H stand for low pressure and high pressure. So you can see here in this chart, the low pressure gets left behind when the warm air rises. As it cools, it rises and forms clouds. Now, when it happens over an ocean, that warm air is going to have with it water droplets or even just vapor that's warm. And so that's going to create a lot of instability. So the high pressure from the colder air up high aloft falls and it flows into the partial vacuum left behind by that warm air when the warm air rose. So the warm air sort of vacates that area and leaves a bit of a vacuum. Again, it's not a forcible vacuum where you're going to get crushed by standing there, but it happens sort of progressively where the sun heats the surface, that rises, the air flows into the partial vacuum. So what we can infer about that is that the bigger the pressure differential or the bigger the temperature differential from the surface to the aloft area, the bigger that pressure differential, the worse that weather is going to be. The worse, the higher the wind is going to be, the bigger the pressure change is going to be, the instability is going to be greater. And so that's going to create a much worse windstorm. Now, as we get into warm air rising, right? So the low pressure system forms where the warm air rises. And so high winds are created by pressure differences, right? So that's going to create instability. When the atmosphere is unstable, that leads to the development of cumulonimbus clouds, and those are associated with thunderstorms. So as it relates to thunderstorms, how does hail come into that picture? Well, as you can see in this wonderful chart by Encyclopedia Britannica, warm updrafts are going up and cold downdrafts are coming down. When the warm updrafts travel upward, they're going to have some amount of water vapor in them. And the thing about that is they're going to carry that water vapor so high that it is going to get very, very cold. So a warm updraft goes up, the air cools, and it's going to bring it up really, really high. That cold air is going to supercool that water vapor. And if you wonder what supercool means, supercooled water is water that is below freezing, but it's not frozen. It's still in a liquid state. So if you've ever gone out, I don't know how cold of the climates you guys are in tuning in, but if you go out to your car in the morning and it's been freezing overnight, you pick up a water bottle. Sometimes before you pick it up, I'll look in. I remember specifically this happening a few times where I had a pack of waters from the grocery store sitting in the back of my truck and it was freezing overnight. And I went in and everything was still water. And I was like, huh, that's so crazy. It's so freezing out here. How could it be still water? And I grab it. And as soon as I disturbed it, it boom, went frost all the way down. It was a wacky thing to watch. I did it 3 or 4 times because I'm like a little kid. I was so curious to see this over and over again. Well, that water was super cooled. It was below freezing, but it was still in a liquid state. So that's what happens in these updrafts. The cumulonimbus clouds are where the updrafts exist, and they carry vertical currents of air that rise rapidly. And the supercooled water that's within these updrafts kind of hangs there because it's still being carried up by these updrafts, and it's just vapor. It's not very heavy. So hailstone formation happens when supercooled water droplets collide with ice particles. And you say, well, I thought you said it was super cold. Yes. Some of the areas, there's going to be some dust, some debris, some particulates in the air that end up actually gathering some of that super cool liquid and freezing pretty much as soon as they come into contact. So you do have little ice chips and you also have super cold water. And so the hailstones form when the super cold water droplets collide with ice particles and other droplets. And as soon as it touches them, just like when I picked up that water bottle, as soon as it touches it, it freezes. And so you've got what ends up being called a graupel embryo. And I'll show you that on the next slide where there's a cross section of a hailstone. But a grapple embryo starts with just a little particulate that's got a little bit of ice around it, and it keeps coming into contact with supercooled liquid. And that supercooled liquid freezes. And then it gets kind of kicked around again. It comes into contact with more supercooled water and it freezes again. And so it's really difficult. I can tell you personally, and I can also tell you from secondhand experience and thirdhand experience, it's really difficult to simulate a naturally occurring hailstone because it's formed this way. It's like a pearl. It keeps kicking around and it keeps accumulating or creating additional layers of ice. And so you've got air pockets in there, you've got all these things, and it forms. And so what you can probably infer from gravity, warm updrafts are sort of overcoming the force of gravity with these smaller droplets and these smaller hailstones. So the bigger the updraft, the bigger the hail, because the bigger the stone is going to need to become to allow the weight of gravity or the force of gravity to overcome the updraft. Okay. So if that's not a lot, let's talk about a cross section of a hailstone. So again, you can see with this really kind of zoomed in cross section. And again, this is literally a giant hailstone that was cut in half. And so you can see the different layers as they form. To me, it's fascinating. Maybe to some people it's boring, but you can actually see if you look real close at that grapple embryo, it does mirror this spherical embryo that was in this slide over on the right there, spherical embryo. It says one side persistently faces downward, and a lot of that buildup happens only on the bottom. And then as soon as it gets bigger, it starts randomly tumbling, and that accretion starts on all sides. So that's a bit more exaggerated on that lower part, but you can see it does happen to be that that embryo sort of started off to the right. So again, that would have been, we can tell that that big hole all the way off to the left is actually the bottom of the stone, or was at some point. So anyway, that's how hail is formed. That's how it happens, right? So you can imagine it's not very easy. And this is kind of part of the reason I'm bringing this up. A lot of the information that we get about how to assess for hail and what does hail do to a shingle? How do we know what it does to a shingle? A lot of that data is collected through tests with simulated hailstones. It's really, really difficult to do that. And nobody's been able to successfully form a hailstone that mirrors a naturally occurring hailstone. Nobody's been able to do it. So all of the tests that are available are like pretty good information, but it's not exact information because we're doing the best we can with the technology we have available to us. So if you go researching on Hague Engineering or IBHS, those places are great sources of information that have conducted some really great field tests. I myself have conducted some really good field tests, but they were deficient in that we don't have any real hailstones to use. And so we also can't study the exact terminal velocity of these stones as they fall, much less study once they reach terminal velocity and they're affected by wind, they're falling faster than gravity will even take them. So we don't have one consistent type of stone. We don't have one consistent terminal velocity. So we can kind of assume a lot of things, and that's how the studies are done. But I'll tell you now, consistency of damage and consistency of the story we're telling, that's going to be the most important thing as it relates to hail damage assessment. So like we talked about as far as updrafts and what keeps those stones up there and not falling, these are the required updraft speeds for hailstones in miles per hour. So your smallest pea-sized hailstone, which is a 1/4 inch, needs a 24-mile-an-hour updraft speed. Now, there hasn't been an official study, on what that correlates to in terms of straight line winds or gusts, but we know that 24-mile-an-hour wind is present even in a 1/4 inch hailstorm. So then if you go up even to the 1 inch, and study the National Oceanic, what is it? An Atmospheric Administration, they say that the most common hail size is between 1/2 inch and 1 inch, or 1/4 inch and 1 inch. They study this, and again, even their data it's tough to go off of concretely because the only things they're particularly worried about are not necessarily damage to property. They're considering hurt, like injuries to people or livestock and all these other things. That usually doesn't happen until you're up over 1.5 inches, 2 inches, up in that range. So it's not considered like severe enough to warrant them to like come out and do it in any intense study until it's endangering people or livestock. And so there's not a ton of research on below 1 inch, but they do say that the majority of hailstorms that come through are below 1 inch. But even in a 1 inch storm, we can see the minimum updraft speed is almost 50 miles an hour. And I don't know if any of you guys have, like, I've heard a lot of people tell me, we had some pretty bad wind out here. We had some pretty bad this or pretty bad that. I can tell you from experience, standing in a 40-mile-per-hour wind is insane. It feels like really rough. So when people suggest to me, like, who knows, maybe we did have 80 miles an hour wind. It's like, I don't know that you did. I'm not saying you didn't. I'll investigate, but it's hard to come up with these wind speeds. They're very, very intense and they're very extreme. So let's talk about hail damage. Now that we've gone through meteorology 101, we know where hail comes from, more or less. We know what causes these high winds. So let's talk about the effects, and let's talk about how to investigate those effects. So again, like we said at the beginning, functional versus cosmetic, right? Functional hail damage refers to damage caused by hail that affects the performance or operation of a structure or object rather than simply its appearance. This type of damage goes beyond superficial marks or dents, impairing the functionality or integrity of the item. Cosmetic hail damage refers to damage caused by hail that affects the appearance of an object or surface, but doesn't impact its functionality or structural integrity. This type of damage is usually superficial, leaving marks such as dents, dings, scratches, and doesn't really affect how the object works or performs. Like we said, that doesn't mean it doesn't need to be addressed. It just means that it hasn't affected the functionality of a material. So a couple examples of how we could differentiate between functional and cosmetic. Cosmetic, and when I say cosmetic, it's almost always going to apply to metal. There are some arguments that people have made about shingles, but again, we're not going to get, that's a whole other webinar. We're not going to get into differentiating that today. But you can see on that siding is no longer performing its function. Its function is to shed water from a home and to not allow water to penetrate the building envelope. Because it's full of holes, it's not doing that. Same can be said for that clay tile roof on the right. Those tiles are broken. They're not stopping water. They're not shedding water from the roof, right? So that's functional damage. So if we can recognize an area that seems to have been affected by hail or wind that is now not performing its intended function, we're going to call that functional damage. And then we can call this on the bottom cosmetic damage, right? We've got some dents, we've got some dings. Nothing's really stopped. Again, the function of that box vent, heat vent, whatever you want to call it. The one on the right is a 750 slant fin or slant back vent, and the one on the left is a 550. Who cares? Their purpose is to ventilate heat from inside the building envelope to out and not allow water back in the process of doing that. So let's talk about performing a hail damage assessment, right? There's probably a lot on the internet about it. There's a lot all over the place about it, and I've taught hundreds of people about it. So I'll tell you one of my keys to performing a hail damage assessment, and we will talk about some of the protocols as well. So I try to teach people to do what I call developing a read progression. And if you're not a football fan, you might be like, what the heck is a read progression? Well, I'll explain it really quickly just so you know why I'm using the terminology. A read progression for a quarterback is it's what guides him on where his eyes should be. And that's why I use that terminology, because what a read progression is basically he's reading what the defense is playing. That way he knows where to throw. And you'll see on the screen, there's a 1, a 2, and a 3. So if he determines that they're in a cover 3 or a cover 4, he's going to throw the portion of the play that they're calling the curl flat concept, right? So that first option is number 1. He's going to look to number 1. If number 1's not open or he sees something unfavorable, he's going to move to number 2, and then he's going to move to 3, which is called a check down. Okay. You don't need to know any of this. There won't be a test. But the reason I use that terminology, aside from me playing college football, is because he develops this read progression long before he's standing on the field. So he has an internal mechanism that forces his eyes to go to the right place. Okay. And that's why I want to talk about a read progression as it relates to a home inspection, or in this case, a storm damage assessment, because I teach this concept. It's slightly different when it comes to a total home inspection, but when you're talking about a storm damage assessment, it's really important to have a read progression, because you walk up on this house and everything's there. It's all in front of you. And so you might catch some stuff. And maybe if you're really, really good, you catch 60, 70% of the stuff that there is to be caught, or just documented, just even to say that there's not storm damage. but it's important to have this process that you sort of work through. And in full inspections, I call it compartmentalizing. And in this case, we're going to use the terminology of read progression. But I want you to sort of train yourself mentally to have your eyes go certain places first, right? Everybody wants to know, is the roof damaged? That's great. I have to look a bunch of places before I get to the roof for reasons that we've sort of touched on, which is consistency. But I need my eyes to go a few different places. So I start low and go high. It's pretty straightforward, but it helps me. So when I look low, it's like, well, what is storm damage going to do down there? Well, the important thing about hail is it's very consistent in the way that it falls directionally, of course. So if hail is coming from the front, there should be pretty consistent impacts throughout the front slope that I could find. Now, none of these are hard and fast rules. I've been on plenty of homes where there was a lot of storm damage to the roofing system and there wasn't necessarily as much to the building envelope, like gutters and downspouts and things like that. But we're still going to collect that information because it all helps to build a story. So number one, I'm going to go low. I'm going to look at, especially the things that jump out to me, even on just this house, are these garage doors. Depending on what direction this house is facing, those garage doors may have some dents in them if the hail was big enough. The wrap around the garage doors, now this looks like some kind of composite material, but if there's aluminum around there, you may see some dents on there. And a big thing on the bottom part is I'm going to look to see how much damage is on that lower part, because it's these lower areas where there's aluminum trim and things like that, they're pretty notorious for getting hit by the landscaper, by kids, driving around bikes and things like that all around the house. So I want to see, like, how much damage does it even look like is down there? And then as my eyes go up, now I can compare what the bottom looks like to what the higher up spots look like. And there's sort of these rules of thumb in the insurance restoration business. Like some people say on a downspout, they're not going to look above they're not going to look below their hip. Or some people say they're not going to look below their shoulder. Because again, if the hail is going to hit low, it should have hit high as well. So again, we're establishing that consistency. So again, we're just going to keep following the upward path that we've developed as far as a read progression. You don't have to do it this way. You can say, I'm going to look at every opening, and then I'll look at the siding, and then I'll, whatever it is that you want to develop, I'm just encouraging you to develop your read progression. That way you're not thinking about where should I look. You're already thinking, I have a category of things that I'm looking for, and I'm going to look at those and ignore everything else. So when I first walk up and I look low, a lot of times in my consulting business, there'll be a contractor meeting with me on site because the insurance companies use me as a consultant to tell them whether, my opinion as an expert, what do I think as far as storm damage? Does it seem like the damage is from a storm? Does it seem like it's not? And a lot of times I have a contractor kind of, I hate to say breathing down my neck as if it's a bad thing, because I've got great relationships with a lot of them, but they're always kind of like, well, what about this? Did you see this? What about, take a look at that. Oh man, I think that. And it's like, hey man, I totally appreciate it. And we're going to look at everything, but I've got my process that I need to go through to get from one thing to the next. So again, that read progression kind of goes from low to high. And then to put that in words, we've got ground level collateral damage. And if you haven't heard that terminology before, collateral damage just means, damage that's happened as a result, but we're calling it collateral because it's not the money ball. It's not like the one thing people are really looking for. It's collateral. It's around the outside of the home. So that's where the gutters, the downspouts, the AC units, all these things come into play. We call that ground level collateral damage. And just like you've got ground level, you've got roof level collateral damage. So that's where we go to next. So again, if you're painting an inspection process, you look around the outside of the home, you do what's called a 360 inspection, or, building envelope assessment, and you kind of look and see, is there any collateral damage? Do you see even a kid's playhouse? Is there any holes in it? Is there any dents in the little copper caps that they put on top of the handrails on decks sometimes? So that's ground level collateral. Roof level collateral, and I'm going to show you illustrations of all this stuff. Usually metal vents or a metal roof that's part of the main roofing system. We're going to call that roof level collateral damage. And then unsupported roof material, which again, I'll illustrate, but mainly you find that on hips, ridges, and valleys. And then you come to hail damage to roof covering material. That's the big one that everybody wants to look at. So ground level collateral damage, like we said, moving from left to right, you've got a couple downspouts there. Somebody rubbed chalk, which is really common in my world, but maybe not in the home inspection world. You may not want to be coloring on things with chalk unless specifically asked to, but those are cosmetic dents to a downspout. You've got functional damage to a couple pieces of siding on that one and a whole lot on the other side, on the one on the bottom. Obviously, holes in the car window would be a really nice indicator that we had a significant storm. And you'll probably see a lot of those. We remove hail dents from your car, people parked up and down the street. But then you've got the AC units. And again, there are criteria for whether or not you want to call that functional damage versus cosmetic damage. I would just leave it in the cosmetic damage category, but there are different views on some people will tell you anything above 40% of those fins that are obstructed is going to affect the efficiency of the unit. And at that point, you really would have functional damage to that unit. So again, that's another topic. But your Tesla, again, if you got your Tesla parked in the driveway and there's a bunch of dents on that, really good chance they were either parked somewhere where there was a hailstorm or there was one at this location. And then on the bottom right, you've got a window screen that's got a bunch of streak marks. And again, functionally, sometimes it does create like pulls in that screen that it really is damaged. Sometimes those are just streaks in the oxidation on top of an older screen. And that brings me to the top right photo, which is what we call spatter. Spatter is a really good indicator for how recent a hailstorm was. There isn't any exact correlation in terms of how long does it take for oxidation to rebuild on the surface of a thing. Really depends on the thing, really depends on how long it took there to get there in the first place. So, we know that it happened sometime somewhat recently. I know that may be dissatisfying for somebody, but it is some level of recency that we can find out by that spatter. Now, a spatter mark itself, you can measure and guess at what the hailstone size might be. Now, then the directionality of the spatter, you can see that biggest spatter mark on that. I think that's an electrical box, but the spatter seems like it's coming towards us, like the stone fell from in front of us coming at us. And you can see those sort of streaks on the back give us a directionality. So we know really what direction that hailstorm came from. And then we know that there was some size hail of some density. And again, I know that might be dissatisfying to some, but when you talk about size of hail, a lot of it has to do with the density as well. So a very dense stone that's 1 inch versus a very slushy stone that's 1 inch is going to cause two different spatter marks. In fact, the slushier the stone, probably the bigger that spatter mark is going to be, because if you know anything about concentrating pressure versus distributing pressure, when that hailstone hits and smashes, that spatter mark is going to be a lot bigger. Whereas if it's a hard stone and it hits, only a small part of that sphere or that semisphere is going to actually make contact and cause that spatter. Case in point, hailstone size, 3-inch hail in Texas. So I don't know why this photo went so huge, but basically spatter's a great reference tool, but it may not tell the whole story is what that slide's supposed to say. But basically, if you look really close, those spatter marks, if I asked most experts, how big do you think the hail was that caused this spatter? Most of them would tell me anywhere from 1/4 inch to 5/8 of an inch. I happen to know for 100% certainty that a 3-inch hailstorm hit this structure. And that is the spatter that those stones created. So probably very hard stones, very dense stones that didn't smash as soon as they hit this piece of flashing. And that is hail spatter, and it is from this storm, but those spatter marks are from 3-inch stones. So some people might say that doesn't seem possible. Like I said, trust me on this, it was. So spatter's a great reference tool. Look for it. Try to find it on the surface of certain bladder things, even in like algae buildup on someone's sidewalk. These are all great things that you can go look for. And again, we're building a story. We're not hanging our hat on any one particular physical characteristic we find, but we're going to look for everything. We want to know, when did this hailstorm fall? What was hailstone fall? When did, how big was the hail? And we're going to do our best, but we weren't there the day it happened. And I won't get into it in this webinar, but some of the technology they use to try to guess at that stuff isn't very reliable. So we'll do our best. We'll do the best we can and create the story that we can create. So roof level collateral damage, right? We did the ground level. Now we've got roof level. So I consider gutters to be a roof level thing. And then you can see you got chimney flashing, you got some metal vents on the roof, you've got some gutter helmet. All these things have very obvious dents in them. That gutter screen all the way in the middle left of the photo, that's a little harder to tell, but you can kind of get the right angle on it. You can get some good pictures and show that hail has dented that. Again, a lot of this is going to be cosmetic, but they're all really good indicators to build a story, right? We're working through our read progression, and it doesn't just have to be locational. Our read progression is a progression in a linear way through reads that we're making, right? So we go, somebody says, hey, I think this roof is hail damaged. That's great. Let's go take a peek at a bunch of other stuff and see what the whole story is telling us. Now, like I said, just as a warning, this isn't a hard and fast rule. Now, these metals that are on this roof, that would be really, really hard to make the argument that these are not damaged, but the roof is. That would be a really, really hard argument to make. But the ground level collateral, sometimes there's obstruction, sometimes it's close to the other house, sometimes the way it was coming in directionally, it just doesn't cause the damage that you think that it would. But on the roof level side, again, that's why we're working through a read progression, because we have one read and we go, okay, I've got an unclear picture there, right? I've got a wide receiver who might be open, but maybe he's not. So I'm going to kind of like move on to the next one. And the only difference is we're building a story, whereas a quarterback's only going to throw to one guy. But it's an imperfect metaphor, but I still use it. So you've got your roof level collateral damage, a few more pictures of some roof level collateral damage, right? So we're moving through our progression. So now we're seeing this stuff. We're seeing dents on all these different roofing material, or sorry, all these different roof vent materials. So we've got all these metals, and again, we can see, some consistency in terms of directionality. We can see some consistency in size. Now, again, some of these vents are really, really old. So sometimes you do have a vent that looks like this, and unfortunately, a roof might get replaced for hail damage, and those rascally roofers might not put the new vents on like they were paid to do. So sometimes you'll have a vent that looks like this on a newer looking roof, and you're like, sheesh, there's a lot of, hail damage up here, but I'm not seeing a whole lot on the roof. That's why we go through our read progression into our next, which is unsupported roof material. Now, I have a good diagram on this that I didn't include in this webinar, but when you see how these materials are installed, especially on the ridge cap, you can see that it's like sort of bent up over an area. And so we call it unsupported because there's not wood directly behind this. There's plywood decking underneath the field area roof materials. But when you come into a valley, when you go onto a ridge, those materials are typically unsupported, especially if you've got a shingle over ridge vent, if you know what that is. That's going to be very sort of spongy. You can push down on it and nothing's really stopping something from trying to punch through. So basically, again, this is our last sort of read before we get into hail damage to the roof covering material itself. So now you've got your roof covering material damage. This is, I will say, this is pretty extreme. This is Colorado or Texas or Oklahoma or, somewhere in Tornado Alley. And like we learned, Tornado Alley kind of produces the biggest hail because it has tornadoes, which have really, really extreme updrafts. So it's going to hold hail up there and allow it to continue to form bigger and bigger and bigger and cause damage like this. All of this damage, I would say, depending on where you guys are tuning in from, if you're in the Southeast like me, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Virginia, we don't get often. Now we do get it, but we don't get often huge, huge hail. A lot of times it's, less than 2 inches. If you get a 2.5 inch hailstorm, every roofer in the entire Southeast will be at your house tomorrow. So we don't get it that much. They get it a little bit worse out in Colorado to the point where it's like, I don't even know if I want to replace my roof again. I just did this last year. So there's your hail damage to roof covering material. So you see this, right? And you go, wow, there's hail damage to the roof covering material. If you want to do a proper storm damage assessment, it would be good if there was a standardized protocol for you to look. Now, why is that? Well, I can tell you that consistency becomes so important in terms of across a roof slope, because this is what we all know to be hail. If I showed a picture of this to anybody, they would say, oh, those are hailstones. And they're, quote unquote, typical hail. I like to tell people that nature happens in circles, right? Water droplets are circles, puddles are circles. Excuse me. Nature usually happens in circles. Sometimes, though, it doesn't. And sometimes we have this atypical hail. There's spiked hail, oblate hail, corona hail, right? So there's no one way that hail damages a shingle because there's no one shape. There's no one definite shape. When we say hail fell, we don't know exactly what shape fell. And again, just like in these pictures, someone's holding this, taking a picture of it, and hopefully sending it to some kind of an authority on the matter that can say, hey, just so you know, this hail looked crazy. But there is no one from one storm to the next. Now it stays pretty consistent within one storm, but from one storm to the next, you might get this like perfectly spherical hail. You might get some spiked hail. You might get these crazy looking corona hail. It's so different from one to the next. So the single most important, the single most defining physical characteristic of hail is consistency. In storm damage assessment, consistency is king, right? So we have a standardized protocol that we use to evaluate hail. It was developed by Hague Engineering. Hague Engineering's been around since 1924, I believe, and they were kind of the pioneers of the Hague test square method. And you don't have to read all this very text-heavy slide. I just wanted to show you that it exists. But if you want to, take a screenshot of it, feel free. Or you could just go to Hague Global or HagueEngineering.com or just Google Hague Engineering, and I guarantee you they'll come up. But they pioneered the 10 by 10 test square. Now, again, it doesn't have to be 10 by 10. Square refers to a roofing measurement of 100 square feet. So as long as you're evaluating 100 square feet, it fits the test square method. So basically, what you do is you create a 10 foot by 10 foot square on any directional face, and that is going to represent that slope, because when hail comes in, it usually blows in, like we said, with high winds, because it's in a low pressure system. The stuff's coming in hot, right? Not literally, but it's coming in from a particular direction, and it's going to come in pretty consistent relative to that direction. So when you're doing an evaluation of a north facing slope, outside of any serious obstructions, there shouldn't be any reason why one spot on the north looks drastically different than another spot in the north. Now, what you'll see, and I'll show you kind of how to perform a test square, when you're selecting your test square location, you do want to avoid certain areas. So certain high traffic areas, these are going to be areas where people are, when they're installing the roof, again, people say, well, nobody's ever been on my roof. How can you say that there's foot traffic up there? Well, a lot of this damage occurs on the day that the roof's being installed, especially if it's very hot outside, right? North Carolina, it's 100 degrees in the summer, really high humidity. These roofing materials are very pliable, and when you walk on them, you can create some pretty nasty scuffs that last a long time. So you want to avoid areas of high traffic so that you can have a clean area that there's not a lot of what we call mechanical damage. There's not a lot of foot traffic. There's just not a lot of stuff. You're going to have kind of a nice open area, unobstructed, that if the hail fell from the sky, it would hit that area. Excuse me. So these green checks kind of represent what I would deem to be the best areas to do the test square on that roof. And since this is an actual roof schematic of a roof I actually looked at, I did put the test squares in those areas. And I'll show you examples of this. So these are the overview photos of that roof. You can kind of see that front area is the top left photo. A very nice wide open area. Not any reason why I should find a tremendous amount of damage in that area. So I picked these 4 spots for my test square in this particular circumstance. And so you can see here on that front slope, nice wide open area where there shouldn't be a lot of foot traffic. Back, nice wide open area, shouldn't be a lot of foot traffic. It's not totally ideal to be this close to a valley because that is kind of a high foot traffic area, but sometimes you just have to pick the biggest slope and get the most open area that you can. And the same was true for the right slope on this. So now step 2 in performing a test square is mapping the test area. Okay. So under ideal circumstances, a 10 foot by 10 foot area is used. Okay. So you want to draw a little corner with a piece of chalk, measure over 10 feet to the right, draw out the right corner, and then do the same for the lower 2 corners, right? So step 3 is labeling the test area. And you can use any identification system you'd like. The Cornerstone method is to label the elevation, the cardinal direction, and the total number of damage. Now, this note up top where it says, remember, a test square is a totaling device, not an inspection device, right? So when we go through what, I call the read progression, hail damage to the roofing system as a whole is something that you identify by looking at the entire roof. And then when you want to say, okay, I think this is hail damage, let me investigate just one step further, and I'm going to quantify how much damage there is. And that's why I say labeling the test area, because I want to check 100 square feet. I want to see how many damaged shingles I find, and then we're going to extrapolate that across the entire slope. And then Haig developed, for probably mostly for the insurance companies, the Dura method. And what the Dura method is, without having to look it up and tell you what all the letters stand for, it's basically to say, when you do a test square, however many damaged shingles you find in that test square, which again is a test 100 square feet, we're going to multiply that number by however many hundreds of square feet there are, right? So if you've got 10 squares on a slope, which is 1,000 square feet, if you do a test square, and to keep number simple, if you find 10 damaged shingles inside of that test square, there would be about 100 across that slope. It's pretty simple. Now, when it comes to the insurance company, why the Dura method would be important is because if you want to do repairs versus replacement, what the insurance companies a lot of times will do will kind of punch this, and they'll do the math and say, okay, if you found 5 in a test square, how many does that represent? How much do we typically allow per repair? That times that many shingles is what we're paying out, more or less than if we just said, hey, why don't you just replace the slope? Now, a lot of them have the discretional authority to replace the slope for whatever threshold they decide. Usually not in the hands of the adjuster, usually in the hands of their boss. Somebody behind in a meeting room somewhere decided, hey, if it's 5 per test square, if it's 8 per test square. So I wouldn't recommend that you have a number per se that you're telling anyone, hey, this is the number you're looking for, because really you want to leave that to the insurance companies. Your number could be 1, it could be 18. It doesn't matter. You're just going to tell them how many you found in a test square. So when you label that test area, it looks like this. You've got the elevation, the front elevation of the home, northeast face, 7 damaged shingles. Same thing with these other slopes. So every test square should have at least 6 photos. And that's kind of just my rule of thumb. You do it however you want to do it. But I've been doing it for 15 years, done it about 10,000 times, literally. So I would, I'd say I like this process. I'll say it that much, or say it that way. So 6 photos of each square, plus a good representative number of hail damage close-ups if you find hail damage. If you have 0, you would have about 6 photos per square. And so this is photo 1. This is a close-up to let someone know this was the elevation of the home. It faces this direction. Here's how much hail damage I find. That could say 10, could say 8, could say 0. Doesn't really matter. The next one is the next 4 photos are what I call quadrant photos. So I want to catch the lower right edge of that writing, and I want to catch the upper left corner of that test square. So that's a quarter of the test square. I want someone to kind of get a good overview of a smaller area that's not the whole test square, but it's bigger than just close-ups on the shingles. So it kind of communicates, hey, look, I looked at this whole thing. I didn't find much. You can see in this photo, there's not a whole lot on those shingles. Same thing here. You can move counterclockwise. You can move clockwise. You can go up, down, if you, whatever you want to do, it's really up to you. This is my method. So I move clockwise and I take my quadrant photos. Then I take a nice big overview to show them, hey, I didn't just take, it wasn't like I was close to a valley and I found 8 blemishes all within 2 square feet of each other, and I'm calling that hail damage. No, I want someone to see these are kind of randomly distributed throughout that test area. And then, so those are your 6 photos. My additional photos would be close-ups of each, representative number of hail damage that I found. Basically, my rule of thumb is if there's up to 4, I take however many there are, and over that, I really just kind of land on 4, unless they're just like really, really good. If it's just like, whoa, that is like textbook hail damage, I might take 20 photos. But for the purpose of, being succinct and concise, you want to just take as many as you need without overwhelming somebody with photos. So again, you've got your 6. Now you take 4 close-ups, which I believe is a good representative number of, anything over 4 really. So there's your impact marks. And now I go to take supporting photos. I go to those ridge caps. Now, again, theoretically, I've already looked at this, but in terms of my process, I just want to make sure I know I have these photos when I go to tell somebody, hey, I think I've got hail damage here. Here's the supporting evidence. Here's how I'm going to tell you that story. And I'm going to go to the ridge caps. I'm going to go to the hips, and I'm going to show them, hey, look, because again, if something is more likely to get damaged by hail, like pretty much anything else is more likely to get damaged. Like most of the roof components, the soft metal vents, just so many different things are more likely to get damaged by hail than the roof shingles themselves. The roof shingles themselves, they've got all kinds of, class 4 impact rated shingles and things like that. So those are the least likely thing on the roof to get damaged. So if I'm telling someone, oh yeah, the least likely thing up here got peppered, but none of the other supporting evidence tells you the same story. I looked at the caps, no damage there. I looked at all the metal vents, no damage there. But man, I'm sure what I'm looking at on this roof is hail damage. Again, you could be as sure as you could ever be, but unfortunately, it's just going to be a very tough sell to the people that, it matters to. Are any of these hard and fast rules? I've already kind of said no, there isn't a whole lot of hard and fast rules in storm damage assessment. So you've got to collect as much data as you can, get as many photos as you can, evaluate as many materials as you can in that one scenario, and build a story for yourself, and really build a story for whoever it is that you're communicating your findings to. So that pretty much concludes the test squares and the hail damage assessment. So let's talk a little bit about wind damage. Now, I'll say generally speaking, wind damage is a little bit more cut and dry. Now, there is a lot of nuance too, because there's a lot of fraud. There's a ton of fraud, and maybe that'll be another webinar someday, but I don't know if home inspectors necessarily need to get into that. But if you're ever interested in doing any roof consulting, you're going to want to get good at recognizing fraud, because the reward is so high that, of course, it attracts a lot of bad actors. It's got a lot of great guys too. There's a lot of guys that I'm personal friends with who do this roofing thing as it pertains to the insurance restoration industry. But it does attract a lot of bad actors because there's a lot of reward for bad behavior. So they try to simulate wind damage. A lot of people ask me about simulated hail damage. I can tell you, when I first started back 2009, I saw it a lot more. This industry's grown and matured a lot. And so your average roof consultant, even if he's not very good or he's very new, could probably tell you what a ball peen hammer looks like, having damaged a roof. And it doesn't look anything like hail. But wind damage, people are a little bit more artistic, and it's a little easier to fake. And to be honest, it's a little bit harder to prove in the negative. Now, the company I now work for, in addition to my company, is an engineering firm. They've got probably 30 plus criteria on how they can tell you that they know something is not wind. But again, we won't get bogged down with all that. Wind damage for us is pretty easy to recognize. And like we said, you've got direct wind damage. It refers to the physical harm or destruction caused to a structure or object as a result of high winds, typically during severe weather events such as storms, hurricanes, or tornadoes. The damage occurs when the wind exerts force directly on the property, causing some kind of a structural failure, displacement, or deterioration of material. Indirect damage, like we said before, it's a result of the secondary effect of the wind rather than the direct force of the wind. So the wind itself, now in insurance world and in the engineering world, you have what you call the efficient proximate cause and the concurrent cause. The efficient proximate cause is what started the problem. That's kind of what we're talking about here, is wind was the reason that the thing got damaged. But the concurrent cause was maybe a tree was the thing that actually did the damage. So the wind itself may not be the immediate cause of the damage, but it creates conditions that lead to harm or deterioration of the property. The type of damage typically results from factors such as wind-driven rain or debris. Usually wind-driven debris is a better use of indirect wind, or usually indirect wind damage is referring to wind-borne debris, not so much wind-driven rain. So this is a good example of some direct wind damage where the shingles themselves have been blown off the roof, sometimes in big patches, sometimes in individual things. And this is easy to recognize. It's harder to differentiate how old it is because sometimes you have a really old roof that's been hit by 25 storms and you can't really tell the difference. To be honest with you, you don't really care as a consultant. You like as an engineer, a lot of people will call and say, "Hey, can you kind of age this for me? Can you tell me like does it seem like there's evidence of multiple storms up there?" As a general rule, you're not going to need to differentiate between damage that happened 3 years ago and damage that happened 3 months ago. You're really just saying, hey, look, I don't have any reason to think this isn't wind damage. It looks like the thing got blown off by the wind, so we're calling it wind damage. So that's direct wind damage. Indirect wind damage, as you can imagine, severe tornado type conditions, hurricanes. Those two top right photos kind of show some framing members that have been blown out of one house into another house. But then the rest of the photos, you can kind of see there's serious tree impact damage. Now, sometimes that lower left photo that you see, that might be all you get because theoretically they're going to clean the thing off before they have somebody come and inspect for it. So you're going to need to do a little bit of digging to find really bad indirect damage that isn't like usually they're going to tell you, hey, a tree fell on my house. I'd really like somebody to come look at it. Now, the bottom right photo, phenomenal. That's great. I mean, the house is unlivable. So, yes, that's very obvious indirect damage. We're not usually so blessed as to have a tree still sitting on the house and showing all the areas it's crushed. Usually we come in the back end. And again, if you look in the middle, that sort of taller, narrow photo, in between that one with the framing members sticking out of the house and the giant tree on the upper left, right in the middle of the frame, you can see there's really just like a scuff, but it's got wood in it. And that's a lot of what you're going to get is like tree limb scuffs, tree limb punctures, those types of things. They're not as easy to recognize, but if you know what you're looking for, again, usually wood remnants in there. And again, if you wait 5 years, what's that going to look like? It's going to look like a whole lot of other types of damage that can occur on a roof. So it's not as easy when it's not very recent, but you got to do the best you can. And that's why we're putting all the pieces together and trying to tell a story rather than picking out every scuff on a roof and saying, maybe it was windborne debris. Well, maybe it wasn't. So let's try to be as certain as we can by finding other criteria that we're looking for to tell a good story and back ourselves up. So now one other thing to pay attention to when you're talking about tree damage to a roof, you've got sudden and accidental tree impact damage, and then you've got tree rub damage. Tree rub damage is considered wear and tear. It's a long-term issue. Insurance companies don't cover it. And you can kind of tell by looking at it that the edges of those torn shingles are a little bit softer. It looks like that's happened, getting rubbed and rubbed and rubbed and rubbed over a long period of time. That's not like a tear. That's not a very obvious puncture. That's just kind of like, man, it looks old, but it looks like something damaged it. That would be called tree rub damage. And again, I will mention that because the shingles are badly degraded, but I definitely won't recommend somebody file an insurance claim for such a thing because that's not sudden and accidental damage that the insurance companies are looking for. So a couple creased shingles. So creased shingles are also a bit, so creased, torn, and missing is really what we're looking for. And again, you might be able to see a couple in here. A lot of them are just torn off, but in that top middle photo, you can see a couple pink lines drawn on some shingles that are not missing. It's because they're creased. And one thing I want to point out is not all creases come from wind damage. So a couple big not wind damage categories are toe boards, which you can see in that upper left photo is a thing that they employ when they're installing a steep roofing system. Sometimes they'll nail a toe board in. Now, there's a proper way to do that. There's a bracket that you can nail in underneath a shingle and hold that piece of lumber to help you get your footing if you're not using, equipment to keep you up there. But the fallout from that when it's not done properly is all these photos that you see. It's a very, very straight, pin straight line. It's not going to be all the way at the top of the exposure. It's going to be just a couple inches down from the top of that exposure, which is odd for wind. Wind won't do that because there's nothing stopping. If the wind unseals one of these shingle tabs and blows it all the way back to where it's going to crease it, it's not going to stop a couple of inches down from its point of resistance. It's going to push all the way through to the natural point of resistance. And then you can see a compromised area all the way at the top. All these areas are, again, you can see they're roughly at the same spot and they're very pin straight. And what you'll find, like in this photo on the lower right, is you'll have one, and then in that same course of shingles, you'll have one or two or three other ones that are all kind of directly in a straight line. Again, is an impossible wind would create that kind of a pattern? Not impossible, very statistically improbable. And again, with such a pin straight line that's so low on the face of the shingle, that's not going to be wind. Our other main category of not wind is pump jack damage. Now, that photo on the lower left is a better photo illustrating this. Unfortunately, it's just not great resolution. But what you can see is they use what they call pump jacks for scaffolding when they install siding. And when they're doing that, those jacks need support on the roof so they don't fall over. So they lift a shingle, they put one of the feet of the bracket down, and I can tell you they're about 30 inches apart. So if you see a hole in a shingle, like you're seeing on these photos here, if you see holes in the shingle and you're going, man, what would have caused that? Measure 30 inches up, measure 30 inches down, see if you see other similar holes directly 30 inches from those spots, and that will be from a pump jack. So usually it doesn't look like wind, but that lower left pump jack photo, the one directly in the middle of the screen, you can see that they creased that shingle. These other ones, they didn't even do them the service of creasing. They just nailed right through the face of the shingle and never fixed it, which I have fixed before. It's actually a pretty easy fix if you use a little bit of sealant, but unfortunately, sometimes people are just moving too quickly to remember to do that, and that can definitely result in a leak. All right. So let's just talk about a few key takeaways. I know we're just over an hour, but we're going to just kind of go through a little summary of what we talked about. So storm formation is a dynamic and complex process that starts with pressure changes resulting in high winds. Remember, you can't have a wind event without hail, but you can have a wind event without hail, but you can't have a hail event without wind. 1-inch hailstones require at least 49-mile-per-hour updraft speeds. Takeaway 2, hail damage can be either functional or cosmetic. Wind damage can be either direct or indirect. There's a long-standing and hard-fought debate over how to define damage more precisely. Determine where you stand on that spectrum and learn to defend that position. So what I mean is if you're calling something damage, there might be people who disagree with you, but of all the people that I've trained to be a roof consultant, to be a ladder assist, one theme that I continuously try to drill into those guys is, look, I've been doing this longer than you. I've been on a lot more roofs than you, and I'm the guy training you. But if you get a different answer than me, that's not discouraged as long as you have a really good reason for saying it. So that would be the thing. The takeaway here is have a good reason for saying what you're saying. Have some good backup. Do some studying aside from this webinar. Kind of dive in a little bit on Hague Engineering's information, Trinity Engineering's information, the different IBHS, these other avenues of information that are available out there. Even InterNACHI's got some great courses on roof inspections that include storm damage assessment and things like that. So try to educate yourself. That way you have better footing for saying what you're saying when you say it. So you might disagree. Not everybody might agree with you. You might not agree with everybody else. But as long as everybody's got a really good reason for saying what they're saying, you'll be fine. Number 3, develop your read progression. As you determine in your own mind what are the first, second, third, on and on things that you look for, you will train your eyes to start looking in the right places automatically. It's going to become automatic to you that you move through your progression. And when someone's on site saying, well, what are you seeing? What are you looking at? Did you see that? Well, my grandmother pointed this thing out. Whatever it is, you've got a process that you're working through, and you'll do one thing at a time, and you'll continue to move through in a very methodical fashion. There's kind of a theory that I have that when you're inquisitive, you develop what I call a vacuum for information, right? So you can give a bunch of information to someone and they might not take any of it away, but as soon as they're curious about it, they will have what I call a vacuum, where as soon as you present that to them, they grab that up and take it immediately. Really quick. Key takeaway number 1 for Heidi: storm formation is a dynamic and complex process that starts with pressure changes resulting in high winds. Okay. And the takeaway for there is wind comes first, hail comes second. So if you're looking at hail damage, keep your eye peeled for wind damage as well. The same is not true for wind. If you have a wind event, you don't necessarily have hail, but if you have hail, you do necessarily have high winds, depending on how big the hail is. If you've got hail damage, there's probably some pretty good size or pretty good speeds of wind there. So, like we said, develop your read progression. What I was getting at was I'm a pretty inquisitive guy, so I develop these curiosities about certain things, and they just kind of exist in my brain, and I call them vacuums because as soon as information presents itself that answers a question that I've already had, I grab that information and I pull it right in. So if you're inquisitive when it comes to storm damage assessment, not even just studying, but on site, if you really want to get the right answer, develop that read progression, develop that curiosity and that inquisitiveness about this. That way, you're pulling in all the details that there are to be had, and you're going to ask the right questions. Number 4, 10 by 10 test squares. Consistency is king. If there was only one takeaway from this entire thing, consistency is king when it comes to storm damage assessment. Hail assessment protocol is necessary because of how consistent hail is within a particular storm, but how inconsistent it can be in terms of size, shape, and density from one storm to the next. So it's very consistent in the way that it damages. So that's why we can use 10 by 10 test squares. And it's pretty consistent in the way that it damages certain items. Oh, it's usually not going to violate certain ideas that you have of there's some very thin metal on the roof that isn't damaged, and yet this class 4 impact rated shingle has a big, bruise in it. If that's the case, you want to kind of pause and look for more consistency. And that's usually what I'll tell people. They'll send me one photo and they'll go, "Hey man, what is this? Do you think that's hail?" It's like, I need like 50 more pictures. I can't tell you if it's hail off of one picture because hail can be shaped and sized so differently, and it can resemble other things. It can resemble foot traffic. It can resemble all kinds of other things that are on a roof. So you need to establish consistency. And our last takeaway is that wind damage assessment is a little bit more straightforward than hail damage assessment, but wind isn't the only thing that creases shingles. Even aside from fraud, there are other reasons shingles get creased. So make sure you take a closer look before labeling something as storm damage. So that's about all I've got. Thank you guys for coming. And if you've got any questions at all, I would absolutely love to field some questions.
So Brett asked, what is the best way to structure your pricing for storm assessment work?
I think that's a good question. I think depending on the volume that someone's giving you, I can tell you just and be frank, like with some of the prices I have now, just to be honest with you, I do kind of carry, a lot of credentials in that realm. So I don't do, and this might stagger some home inspectors because I know what some of the minimum charges are for home inspections to inspect every system of a house. But I really wouldn't even think about doing a thorough storm damage assessment and report for less than 650 in my area. Um, that's just what I charge now. I've gone much higher, and I wouldn't even, I don't have any reason to tell you how high I've been paid for certain things. It doesn't really matter. But if you're going to structure it, I would say do it like you do most other things. How long is it going to take you? And this isn't your normal exterior inspection. It isn't your normal roof inspection. So you can feel comfortable telling someone a price that might even exceed your normal price, but that's just kind of the way specialism is, right? If you have a specialist doctor, usually he gets paid more than your normal, primary care physician. Why is that? Because he's honing in on one particular thing to get you one particular answer that you need and hopefully one particular solution to a problem. So I would say try to value your time. Think about how long is this going to take me? What kind of safety considerations are there? And move up from there. I can tell you that your normal ladder assist who does a ton of these, those companies will get 60, 100 requests a month sometimes from insurance companies. Those guys can charge as low as like 175 for an assessment, but they're not getting a very good report. And those guys that are in and out of there in 15 minutes are just kind of getting them a simple yes or no. So for a thorough inspection, I would say you should be up in like $500 plus.
We have one. Heidi wants to know if you can go over key point number 1 real quick.
I already did that for her.
Okay, sorry. JN asks, how do I identify and mark damage using drones? How do I identify and mark damage using drones, especially in asphalt singles? For indirect wind damage, house owners picture how does house owners picture of tree on the roof a valid piece of evidence?
Is this multiple questions or just one?
There's multiple questions in the Q&A if you want to look it over.
Yeah, no, I'm looking there. I'm not seeing the one that you're talking about, but I'll touch Kenneth's question real quick on do you use drones to inspect and take photos? Um, I'll say this, a drone is never really a good way to come up with a definitive answer. For the purpose of insurance, some insurance companies have actually employed drones as their primary means of inspection, just because if they're very lenient insurance companies and they don't mind paying, it's easy to kind of justify paying by finding some blemishes that are pretty consistent. So to get some really good overviews to establish some consistency, yes, you can use a drone, but I don't know that I would really hang my hat on much from a now. Well, to be honest with you, I could probably um, just because I've been at it for a long time. But I don't know that I would ever. I've never done it. I've never only done it using a drone. I've used a drone a lot, and especially in a wind event. A wind event is a really good use for a drone because you can see the whole roof. You can kind of tally up the shingles, and you can get a pretty good idea with the wind damage on a drone. Hail damage, it's a little bit more nuanced because not every blemish can be counted as hail. It's a little tougher to mark out a definitive test square, but I mean, if you're willing to exhaust some options, you could definitely do it. And then how long on average does it take you to do the inspection? Myself personally, if it's a full storm damage assessment, let's just assume it's like a normal size house. There's no outbuildings. I would say for me, I could do it in about 45 minutes to an hour if I'm taking my time. If I need to get out of there in 15 to 30 minutes on a smaller job where there's no hail damage, that's a little easier. But when there is hail damage, that kind of like pauses you and goes, okay, well, I've got to really look at all the other things that might be affected because if they're going to take this information and bring it to an insurance company to make a claim, they don't want to be missing out on things that were damaged in addition to the roofing material. So I would say 45 minutes. I would say for any new guys that I have do this, usually about an hour and a half. And on the engineering level, some of the guys that I've helped to do that, they're usually up in the hour and a half to 2 hour range just because they're going to really comb over the thing and kind of speak to a lot of different things that you don't necessarily have to. So I'd say about an hour, just shoot for an hour. And then how to identify and mark damage using drones, especially in asphalt shingles. There is no marking damage. There is some software that Loveland Technologies has come out with where they will inspect a roof and it has like, I don't know if it's fully AI, but they kind of teach it a level of sensitivity for differentiating between a normal part of the shingle and a blemish. It's tough because there are some like organic growths and things like that that can look like a blemish to a software, and so it starts calling things out. So I would say drones are not your most reliable way to identify damage, and they're not at all a useful way to mark damage. And then for indirect damage, does a homeowner's picture of the tree on the roof, is that a valid piece of evidence? I'd say it's a valid piece of evidence because it shows, I mean, especially like what I do, I have time and date stamps and geo stamps on my photos so that you can tell, look, I'm taking this picture on this day at this time in this location. That's a great piece of evidence. But it is a good piece of evidence as long as it correlates to what you're seeing.
Awesome. Well, man, I think that's good. I don't see any more questions. I think you got them all.
All right.
I
Awesome. Well, thank everybody for coming. We really appreciate it.